Hi everyone, and thank you for watching another Gaffer in Gear. In today's episode, it's a very quick catch-up. We're having a look at the 36-degree barrel for the Nanlite mini projector, which is for their 60s, and the Forza 150s. And we're also going to take a look at the iris. Alright, so a couple of things have changed with these projectors since I first reviewed them. So the first thing that's changed is the name. So they're whatever that says down there now. So they've changed the name of them. And the reason they've changed the name is when these came out, they only had the 60. And now they've got the 150 as well. So they don't want to refer to this as a 60. So hence the name change. The next thing that's changed is when I first reviewed these, they came with a gobo holder that was 150 millimeter across, which is not an industry standard. So they had their own sized gobos. Now you can also get a M series gobo holder as well. So that opens you up to literally thousands of different gobos that are available. Now, of course, the one thing to note is there a different sized hole. So if you're using a M series gobo in this unit, you are not going to get the full 36 degrees because being a smaller slot or a smaller hole, it is going to choke up some of the beam a little bit. Now, a couple of things have taken me by surprise with these 36-degree lenses. Number one is how bright they are. I was expecting them to be nowhere near as bright. So with the 36-degree lens and the Forza 60, you get 4 times the amount of light through the barrel than you otherwise get off the light. So even in here with all the lights on, it's competing pretty well. So I was quite surprised by that. With the Forza 150 on the back, you get 3 times the amount of light than you otherwise would get off the light going through the projection barrel. So very impressed by that. The other thing that's really sort of taken me by surprise is how sharp the optics are. I was expecting them to be a little bit dull, considering that it's a 36-degree lens compared to, say, the 19. But I really am surprised at how sharp the optics are. For a 36-degree barrel, I really am surprised. But it sort of does make sense because it's such a small projection mount that it would have sharp optics, because the smaller your light source, the sharper it is. Now, the next positive for these, and it has taken me a bit by surprise, I must admit, is how even the beam is. I wasn't expecting the beam to be this even, particularly for a 36-degree. It's about as even as the 19-degree beam is. Now let's get into some of the negatives, and you might have already spotted this first negative. There is a little bit of color shift between the edge of the beam to the center of the beam. So at 3200 Kelvin, which I've got it set to now, where my hand is 300 Kelvin higher than the center of the beam. So it's not that noticeable in tungsten. So about 300 Kelvin difference from there to there, and the bulk of that changes in this range here. Now let's take a look at 5600 degrees Kelvin. So the difference between the center and where my hand is 600 degrees Kelvin. Now from my fingertips to about my palm, that's about a 300 degree Kelvin difference, and then from where my fingertips were to the center of the beam, that's only about 300 Kelvin. So that's pretty normal on a lot of flood glass optics. Now there is one last thing that's a little bit odd with this projector system, and that is if you compact up the beam. So if you compact it by either reducing the beam size using your blades or using the iris, there is also a noticeable color shift. Okay, so between here at full width and say about here, so I'm just using the iris, there is a 300 degree shift in Kelvin in the center value. So that is 300 degrees cooler in the center value than it is there. Okay, so let's have a look at how this thing goes now projecting a gobo. And one thing to note with this projector is it only has the one slot for your iris and for your gobo, so you can't use both in combination. Now, what I found with this lens is if you put the gobo in orientated around that way, it's very hard or pretty much impossible to get a universal focus across the gobo. So, the top's in focus, the bottom's in focus, or the center, it's impossible to get the whole lot into focus. But what I found is if you spin it around the other way, you can get a very good focus. Now, because it's such a wide slot and such a wide gobo holder, if you don't get a very crisp focus across the gobo, just try reinserting it or just pressing it a few times in the gobo holder, giving it a bit of a tap or a shake, just to try and make sure the gobo is sitting absolutely flat and not on a bit of an angle. And you can get quite an impressively sharp gobo. So let's see how we go here. So I'm not quite impressed with how sharp that is. So I reckon I can get it sharper than that. All right, that's pretty good. So let's have a look at that. That is crazy sharp. Okay, I'll get that a bit sharper with the projector. There you go, that's really sharp. Let's go in and take a closer look. Okay, so as you can see there, there's minimal chromatic aberration. So let's try a white piece of paper. Very minimal. Very, very impressed with that. Now I've got the bicolor 60 on here and I've got a dapple pattern. So let's see how much range we've got in terms of defocusing this. Okay, at that point there, I'm starting to see the checker pattern on the COB. Let's go back the other way. As you can see there, there's minimal chromatic aberration in the defocusing. Right, let's have a look at defocusing a slash now and seeing if we get any noticeable chromatic aberration through our defocusing. So I'm defocusing backwards. Defocusing backwards is usually the cleanest way to defocus. So there I've hit the back of the focus. I can't go any further out of focus than that. I'm too close to the wall. So let's try forwards. Very clean defocus. No noticeable chromatic aberration there at all. Now what I'm testing for here is concaving or convexing. So I'm using the blades to do cuts and I'm lining them up with the garage beam so you can see if there's any convexing or concaving there. And there is the ever so slightest amount of concaving on the top line, ever so slightest amount. You'd be really hard pressed to see it unless you were really, really looking for it. So I'm very impressed with that. All right, let's go through the spectrometer readings for the 60B going through this projection mount set to 3200 Kelvin. And on screen now is the light without the modifier and the light with the modifier. So you can see how little change there is in the Kelvin values going through the projector. All right, let's take a look at the rest of the stats. With the Forza 60B set to 3200 Kelvin at a distance of 3 meters, I got 929 lux, which works out to f5.6 and 4/10 at 800 ISO. The CCT came in at 3192. The SSI came in at 83. The TM30 colour vector results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores and only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0027, which means the light has a magenta hue to slightly more than a 1/8 correction gel. All right, let's have a look at how the Forza 60 goes in daylight now through the projector mount. And as you can see by the stats on screen, there is a slight increase of less than 100 degrees Kelvin through the projector and an imperceivable change in hue. However, as you can see by the bottom line, I would recommend dialing in 5300 Kelvin if you're fussy. All right, let's take a look at the other stats. With the Forza 60B set to 5600 Kelvin at a distance of 3 meters, I got 1230 lux, which metered in at f5.6 and 9/10 at 800 ISO. The CCT came in at 6017, the SSI came in at 72. The TM30 colour vector results were 92% average colour accuracy with a 99% average colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R9 and R12 are both below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution, and the white point comes in with a delta UV of plus 0.0021, which places it above the Plancking curve by roughly about a 1/8 correction gel towards green, but positions it just below the daylight curve. All right, so let's have a look at how this setup goes with the Forza 150 on. Now, this projector mount is optimized for the Forza 60, which has a smaller COB. The 150 has a larger COB, so that's going to give us some optical problems or optical trade-offs. Now, the first trade-off you usually get when a projector mount is optimized for a smaller COB is you don't get as much intensity out of the light or out of the projector mount when you pair it up with a bigger light. Now, that's sort of the case with this, but it's not a big deal. So with the Forza 60, I was metering 4 times the amount of light through the projector mount. With the Forza 150, I'm only metering 3 times the amount of light through the projector mount, but that is still a heap more than you get off the 60, so it is worth running the 150 through this projection mount. So as you can see here, we've got plenty of light levels, so that's easily overcoming the light that's in the room. And to give you some idea, I've got a, what is that? That's a Aladdin fabric light about 1.5 meters away from me running at 100% power. I've got another one here running 50% power, and I've got a Forza 200 bounced off the ceiling. So we've got a lot of light in here, and we're easily overpowering it with the Gobo. All right, so let's start going through the differences between having the 60 and the 150 mounted on this. All right, so with the 150, because it's a bigger COB, it's wrapping around the cutouts in the Gobos a little bit more. So what does that do? Well, it makes your blacks a little bit milky. So as you can see here, the blacks inside the Gobo projection are not a solid black like they are on the wall around it. Now, in addition to this, you do get some spill light coming off the barrel that you don't get with the 60, but this is only noticeable if you're exposing right into your dark areas. Also, if you're doing a cut, you can see where the rest of the barrel is, but once again, only if you're exposing really deeply into your darks. Now, where this could be a problem is if you're trying to make very fine shapes. Now here, for example, this is fine, but if we're doing it in absolute darkness, you do get a halo around the shape that you don't get if you're using the 60. However, with your Gobo projection, it pretty much makes no difference whatsoever. The next thing with the 150 is you can't get a Gobo completely in focus. It's either in focus in the center or it's focused on the edges, not both at the same time. Now, for the bulk of the work I do, this isn't an issue because that would be focused enough in a background, or I'd be using something like this as an out of focus dapple. But where it could be an issue in corporate land is if you've got a logo or a company name that you need to project on a wall. That is when they absolutely want a sharp focus all the way across the beam. Now, just like with the Forza 60, when you defocus the Gobos, there is minimal to zero chromatic aberration or color fraying. Now, just like with the Forza 60, when you do your cuts, there is a minimal convexing or concaving. Now let's take a look at the consistency of the Kelvin across the beam, and there are a few little things that are odd with this combination. So from the center to about here, there's a difference of 200 Kelvin. So it gets warmer towards the center of the beam than towards the edge. Then from the edge here to about there, there's another 200 Kelvin. So the difference between the very edge to the center is about 400 Kelvin, but not really all that noticeable. The next thing is if you box up using your cutter blades, the Kelvin increases, but not by a lot. So with a small box like this, the center value is 200 Kelvin warmer than if you have the blades open. But here's where things get really odd. Let's use the iris. Between the widest point on the iris and our tightest hole, the difference is 500 Kelvin in the center value. So if you were using this as a follow spot effect and closing and opening, it would be very noticeable. Okay, so let's get into my test results now. And as you can see here, with the Forza 150 through the 36-degree barrel, there is a Kelvin drop of about 240 Kelvin. With the Forza 150 at a distance of 3 meters, I got 2,360 lux, which works out to f8 and 9/10 at 800 ISO. The CCT came in at 5,247 Kelvin. The SSI came in at 74. The TN30 colour vector results were 93% average colour accuracy with an average 100% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0033. which places the light off the Planckian curve towards green by somewhere between a 1/8 and a 1/4 correction gel, but places the light nicely on the daylight curve. Now, the last thing to talk about in this episode is the iris, and the iris does seem to be very well constructed. Now, the leaves or the blades, they're a bit more solid than a lot of other ones, so you can do things like that. If it gets a minor impact, it's not going to knock the blades out of position. So that's been something that's been an issue with other brands. The other thing that seems pretty good to me is the actual stick itself that you do the adjustments with. One problem I've had with a lot of other brands is when you go to take the iris out, the stick comes loose and then you're stuck with the iris jammed inside the unit. So that doesn't appear to happen here. The only negative I've got with the system is there's only the one slot here for both your iris and for your gobo. So you can't use an iris in conjunction with the gobo. All right, I'm Andrew Locke. See you on the next episode of Gaffer and Gear.